Good evening and welcome to our webinar. My name is Nicola Palmer and I am the Marketing Manager at the Rural Planning Company. I am responsible for organising, amongst other things, our events, which includes a series of webinars this year. This is our second, and we decided that farm permitted development rights were an important topic to cover this evening. As many of you will be only too aware, these are testing times for farmers, and it is beneficial for you to be aware of the planning permitted development rights that are available to you and how to utilise the planning system to grow your farm business. You will hear firstly from Sally Moore, who will give us a recap on what is available to the farmer through the planning system. Sally is the Managing Director at the Rural Planning Co and has planning and rural professional experience across a broad range of sectors, predominantly focused on agriculture, equestrian, leisure, tourism, glamping, diversification and residential schemes. As a farmer's daughter from Worcestershire, Sally particularly enjoys helping farmers to achieve their business goals. We will then hear from Hannah Mole, who will cover how to make the most of these permitted development rights to grow your farm and diversify your business. Hannah is the founder and director of the Rural Planning Co, a rural chartered surveyor and planning consultant. Hannah not only has a wealth of knowledge, but also what can only be described as a huge passion for agriculture and rural business. Also a farmer with her husband, Hannah strives to help farmers achieve their goals through effective use of the planning process. We will be taking questions from the audience during the presentation. Please feel free to post these on the chat and we will either cover them off during or at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over now to Sally.
Excellent. Right, thanks Nicola. Evening everyone. I'm going to talk through some of the rights that are available for new agricultural development on farms. This is only a brief summary and the legislation can be quite complex, so of course, as ever, if in doubt, then please do seek professional advice. I'm also going to be generally talking about the rules in England, although very similar rules do apply in Wales. So I'm going to start off with a geeky bit. What do I actually mean by permitted development? Well, development in planning terms is the carrying out of most physical works or changing the use of buildings or land. And almost all works which are classed as development require consent. But the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order, or the GPDO, is the government's way of granting blanket consent for proposals which comply with set criteria to avoid them all having to go through the full planning process. It's not the same as saying that you don't need permission, which is a common misconception, but it's saying that if you do comply with all of the relevant criteria, then your development is already deemed to be permitted. There's no requirement to comply with planning policies, and quite a lot of agricultural works can be covered under permitted development if you know your way around the legislation. Unusually, agricultural PD rights apply in most geographical areas, regardless of designations like Greenbelt, AONB or national parks, but it's important not to look at PD in isolation. It doesn't avoid the need to comply with other areas of the law, such as habitats and species legislation or the need for listed building consent. PD doesn't override planning conditions attached to previous permissions either, so watch out for those. And the rights can also be limited or removed by Article 4 directions, which are specific restrictions on a property. So for my section, we're looking here at Part 6, Classes A and B of the GDPO. Class A applies if the agricultural unit is more than 5 hectares or around 12 acres, and Part B if the unit is between 0.4 and 5 hectares, which is between 1 and 12 acres. The headline here is that development is permitted which is reasonably necessary for the purposes of agriculture within that unit. It's absolutely essential that there's an existing trade or business. It can't be a new enterprise. But that doesn't mean to say the business has to be profitable or large. Your agricultural unit can comprise both owned and rented land. And as part of your proposals, you'll need to demonstrate justification in relation to what you're looking to do and your land available, etc. Increasingly, we're seeing councils using external agricultural consultants to appraise the application, so that justification is really important. So, on units over 5 hectares, you can erect, extend or alter a building and carry out excavation or engineering operations, which is quite a broad range there. There's lots of criteria to comply with, and I'll summarise the key ones in relation to different types of development. Starting off with buildings. They must be on a parcel of land more than 1 hectare. You can have up to 1,000 metres squared of ground area, which is absolutely huge, every 2 years. You can't have an agricultural building under permitted development if you've done Class Q within the previous 10 years and vice versa. The height of the building can be up to 12 metres or slightly less, well, quite a lot, significantly less if you're in the vicinity of an aerodrome. Some other points is that it can't be within 25 metres of the metalled part of a classified or trunk road. If you're within 400 metres of a protected building, which is a dwelling that's not connected to either your farm or anybody else's farm, then the building can't be used for livestock, slurry, biomass or anaerobic digestion. If you're not in a national park or the Broads, then minor extensions and alterations can be done without having to notify the council, but beware of Class Q implications on that, which I think Hannah will come on to later. But for new buildings or anything significant, there is an application process to the council known as a 28-day notice. Moving on to tracks. You can have tracks through PD that can connect to a road or create an entrance so long as the road is unclassified. Otherwise, if the road is classified, then you've got to be at least 25 metres away from the metal part of that road. Just out of interest, 60% of UK roads are unclassified, small lanes that are for local travel. See your local highways authority or findmystreet.co.uk if you're not sure whether the road is classified or not. Internal tracks, going across the middle of fields are also permitted development, and there's generally a limit of 1,000 metres squared to the area that you can do within a track under this. You can have hard standing or concrete around a building or as a standalone pad. The 1,000 metre squared limit applies if that area is linked to a building or if the purpose is going to be for accommodation of livestock or plant or machinery, so vehicles, hence why the tracks come under that as well. There are some exceptions to that 1,000 metre squared limit, such as bale storage. We can also have other types of storage. Muck and slurry storage, i.e. buildings or tanks, are permitted so long as they're not within 400 metres of a protected building. 1,000 metre squared limit applies even to tanks, as a building, technically in planning terms, includes any structure or erection. Beware as well that other regulations apply, such as the SAFO regs, which is the silage, slurry and fuel oils regulations, and Environment Agency's consultations also needed for slurry. Slurry lagoons, again permitted if not within 400 metres of a protected building. The 1,000 metre squared limit doesn't apply here though, as they're considered excavation or engineering works. Depending on what you're looking to do, you'll likely need quite detailed drawings and possibly even soil testing if you want to have an earthquake lagoon. And again, watch out for other regulations. And irrigation pools. The 1,000 metre squared limit doesn't apply again here as it's excavation or engineering works. And as another note, you can't import waste material to construct or line these, but you can have clean material like clay. Now, if your unit is between 0.4 and 5 hectares of agricultural land, then Class B allows some rights, although they're more restrictive than what's allowed on larger holdings. You can extend or alter a building, but not construct a new one, install plant or machinery or a range of utilities and apparatus, alter tracks, hard surfaces, deposit waste, and carry out works for fish farming. The criteria are generally similar to what I've already covered, such as that you can't be within 25 metres of a classified road or 400 metres of a protected building for livestock or slurry, with a few new limitations too. You can't affect the external appearance of a premises. For changes to buildings, you can't increase the height, the cubic content by more than 20% or be more than 30 metres away from the original building, and you can't be within 5 metres of your boundary. The 1,000 metre squared limit also applies here. If you're extending a building, the whole building now can't be more than 1,000 metres squared. So I mentioned the requirement for prior notification. So what is that? Well, it's the submission of an application to the council, which they have 28 days to respond to, hence why it's often referred to as a 28-day notice application. It's not technically a planning application, you're not actually seeking permission, but it's an application for determination whether prior approval is needed from the council in relation to the siting, design and external appearance of your proposals. It's a prior approval application, so you can't have started any work already. The council must respond within 28 days, and if they don't, then you can assume that prior approval is not required and therefore that you're okay to go ahead. If they say prior approval is required, it just means that the timeline is extended and the council will look at it in a bit more detail. Development must then be carried out within 5 years and must be in accordance with the details that you've submitted. A bit of a quirk in the small print here to watch out for is that if the use of agriculture permanently ceases within 10 years and no other planning permission has been given, then technically buildings granted under PD should then be removed. So to apply under a 28-day notice, you need to submit a written description of proposals, detailed justification, plans, which depending on your proposal could include site plans, elevations, floor plans or cross sections, and the planning fee due to the council. A few pointers here for things which are not permitted development under Part 6. Hedgerow removal, so I mentioned access and tracks being allowed under PD, but that doesn't allow for the removal of any hedges. Residential or works to any dwelling. Anything that's already started, if prior notification is needed for that work, so this can't be done retrospectively. And anything not agricultural, so if it's conservation, recreation, hobby, or anything non-business related, then it doesn't come under this permitted development right. But don't forget, just because it's not PD doesn't mean you can't still apply under full planning permission. Lastly from me, a brief idea of costings for a 28-day notice application. So overall, for most applications like this, it would be sensible to budget up to around about £2,000 plus VAT. Now I'll hand back to Nicola before we move on to Hannah's section this evening.
Brilliant. Thank you.
There we go. Can you see that now?
Yeah, we can see that now. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Sally and Nicola. Sorry, I'm a bit of a technophobe and haven't got a Scooby-Doo how to work most of this stuff. So obviously Sally's talked about permitted development rights for agriculture, and I'm going to move on and talk about the permitted development rights that apply to farms, but that are sort of non-agricultural in nature. And again, what I'm going to talk through is some of those permitted development rights, and then I've just got a small section at the end about strategy and how you might be able to use permitted development rights to help grow your farm business. So the four main ones that I'm going to cover is Class R, which is commercial, Class Q, which is residential, the temporary change of land, and caravans and camping. So first of all, I'm going to start with Class R. Now, just again, going back to what Sally was saying, what we're talking about here is permitted development rights. So this is the government has already said that subject to you meeting or the building meeting certain criteria, you already have the permitted development right, the right to change the use that we're going to talk about. In most instances, we have to do a prior approval notice, again, very similar to sort of the 28-day type of procedure, although in most instances it's longer. So we still have to notify the council. It kind of still feels like a planning application, but what we're basically doing is giving them notice that you intend to exercise your permitted development rights. So there is a subtle difference. And in many instances, using permitted development rights is a much easier path than applying for planning permission for the same reasons that Sally outlined. So first of all, Class R, this is the change of use of an agricultural building to commercial use. And the types of use that you can change it to is quite wide and quite varied. So the first off is B8, storage and distribution. C1 is hotels. I've never done one of those. But Class E is the main one, and this covers most commercial businesses or services. So I've given you some examples there, but yes, a Class R, you can change the use of an ag building to any of those uses using your permitted development rights, so long as you meet the criteria. So when they introduced Class R, there was a reference date, but we have now gone past that. So we're basically on a rolling 10-year period now. So the building, in order for it to have Class R rights, must have been up, it must have been in position, and it must have been used for agriculture for the last 10 years. So if we're thinking May 23, it needs to have been there in May 2013. Under Class R, you can change the use of up to 500 square metres of floor area. And I'll give you an example of what that size shed is in a minute, but it is quite big. That's on one planning unit. If you have multiple farmyards or multiple areas that you farm, they are quite arguably different planning units, although that's a bigger question in itself. But so there might be opportunity to use this on, it's not within your farming business, it's on a planning unit. So if you have multiple holdings, we can probably use 500 per holding. We'd have to have a look at it. But you can't do a Class R on a listed building if it's a scheduled monument or within a safety hazard area. But this is a good one because you can use it in a national park, in a conservation area and an AONB. And the building doesn't have to be redundant at the point of application. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is an application process. If you are converting less than 150 square metres of floor area, we only have to write a letter to the LPA, which is the local planning authority, notifying them. If it is over 150 square metres, so 150 to 500, then we have to go through that prior approval notification process. So the only things that they can actually refuse it on, though, is highway impacts, noise, contamination risks, and flood risks. So as Sally said, they can't start to look at planning policy and whether the neighbours will like it or anything. They can only refuse it if the local authority deem that one of those 4 issues might arise. And actually sometimes, and more often than not, they apply a light touch to permitted development applications anyway. The one thing to remember with Class R is that this only applies to the change of use. So if you're thinking about a building, all we're talking about is the use of the building, and we're changing it from agriculture to something commercial. If you need to undertake external works, i.e. to clad it, roller shutter doors, etc., then you would require planning consent for those works. I mean, there might be plenty of examples of buildings which are either already completely clad and you don't need to do anything at all to facilitate the change of use, or it might be that on a more open building, your tenant or whoever's going to be occupying it doesn't require it cladding, and that's fine, you can just do the change of use. But if it is like this type of building where you would enclose it, then you would need to do the Class R first, then followed by a planning application just for those physical alterations to the building. So my second permitted development from agriculture is Class Q. This is reasonably well known about now, and this is the change of use of an agricultural building to residential. So what it does is the Class Q actually grants the change of use and, in this instance, associated building works from an agricultural building to residential. And those associated building works can be installing walls, roofs, doors, windows, and so on. So you can undertake work that is required to reasonably change the use of that building. The original agricultural building can be any type of agricultural building, so long as it meets the criteria. So it can be breeze block, steel frame, at cost, brick, stone, anything. There is no limitation on the material that the original building is, so long as, and this is the principal criteria for Class Q, so long as that the building is structurally sound in the first place and is capable of being converted without excessive works. Now, there's been a lot of case law and an awful lot of appeals on various buildings as to what is considered to be a conversion versus a rebuild. And without trying to create ourselves jobs, this is very often where a professional earns their money, because, you know, we've seen so many of them, we can start to differentiate what buildings will and won't meet that particular criteria. So some of the other criteria, again, we've got a rolling reference point now. So the building must have been there 10 years ago, so May 2013, and it has to have been in agriculture at that time, and it must be in agriculture when you apply for the prior notification. The building can't be a listed building, it can't be a scheduled monument, or it can't be in a safety hazard area. The building doesn't need to be redundant at the time of application, but it does need prior approval, and that's a 56-day process. That involves full drawings, showing how the building is capable of being converted, that it's structurally sound, number of other elements to that prior notification process. Unfortunately, Class Q doesn't apply in national parks, AONBs or conservation areas. There was some talk a while ago in the press, in the trade press, about extending it to certainly some of those areas, but we've heard nothing more about that since, so it doesn't sound like that's made any progress, unfortunately. So the sizes of what you can change from an agricultural building to residential is quite convoluted, and I won't go through it all here. We tend to sort of have to work out what the existing footprint is, whether it can get a first floor in, where the bays are, how it all splits up and so on. But basically you can have up to 3 what's considered large dwellings, and that's anything over 100 square meters, as long as the total of those 3 does not exceed 465. But you can have up to 5 small dwellings of up to 100 each, and you can have a combination of. So in theory, if you wanted to absolutely max out on your floor space, then you could have 1 large one at 465 and 4 small ones at 100 each. So in theory, you could get up to 865 square meters of floor space converted under Class Q. That configuration is quite odd, to have 1 massive one and 4 small ones, so we rarely do it like that, and it's normally that we sort of have 2 large ones or 3 large ones and 2 smaller ones or something, but depends on the size of the original building, and it depends on whether you can get a first floor in. When you're working out the space though, you've got to remember what I'm talking about here is floor space, not footprint. So you've got to, you can add the first floor if there's room, which can give you additional floor space, but you must also remember that that comes into the calculation as well, so you can't go over that. The last thing to say on Class Q is that as Class Q has developed over the years, we've now got to the position where we can actually use Class Q as a fallback position. So what I mean by that is Class Q is a really useful permitted development right, because it means that we can get permission for residential property in a location where we would never otherwise get it. So in the middle of the countryside, on farms, you know, anything outside of the towns and the village boundaries, we would never ordinarily be able to get a residential dwelling. But Class Q does have its limitations. So we've got the size limitations. We can't go beyond the boundaries of the current size of it. It's got limitations in terms of garden size, design. So what we can now do is basically bank your Class Q so long as you meet the criteria, and then we follow up with a planning application afterwards. And what we're in the position then of doing is changing the design, reorientating the building, adding a bit, taking away a bit, and it might even be in some instances, which we have done and been successful with, where we can knock it down and build a brand new dwelling in its place. Now that dwelling doesn't even need to look like a barn. In some instances we have managed to get it where we've knocked down a steel frame building and actually just got permission for a house in its place. So use the Class Q in some instances as a way of getting that fallback position, and then we can go on and do other things with it. So moving away from buildings, and this is now moving on to permitted development rights for land, you have got the permission to change the use of your land for up to 28 days a year. So it's a temporary change of use. There's a few criteria here to run through. It can't be in your garden. It's reduced to 14 days for just a few specific uses: car boots, markets, car or motorcycle racing. You can only have 14 days a year. If the land is in a triple SI, which is a site of special scientific interest, then you can't use it. You can't do a change of use for bike, car racing, clay pigeon shooting, war games like paintball or anything. The days don't need to be consecutive. So, for example, a very common use of this is if people want to hold events on the farm. So just to do a few weddings a year, for example. So, so how you count this is you count the days that have a different use on it. So, for example, if the marquee goes up on a Thursday, marquee is there Thursday, Friday, wedding Saturday, comes down Sunday. You have now used 4 of your 28 days. It then goes back to agriculture, and then in a few weeks' time you can do the same again, up to a maximum of 28. where this really comes in is twofold, really. One is that a lot of our clients tend to use this 28 days to kind of experiment with new projects or sort of diversification without going to the expense and arguably stress of planning. You know, the neighbours aren't going to be, the neighbours can't do anything about this. This is, you know, you have got this right. So you can do the 28 days without them. They might, I don't know whether they'll kick off or not, you never know, because it's neighbours, but they can't do anything about it. You've got this right. And so you can try these things and see how it goes without going to the full expense of getting planning. So that's a great way of trying a new business. And also there are some designations where we probably are just unlikely to be able to get you planning permission. So green belt is unlikely if you're going to be putting up permanent facilities. AO and Bs, which is areas of outstanding natural beauty, will be difficult too. So use it where you want to trial and where you would otherwise not be able to get planning. So moving on to caravans and camping. I'm just going to do caravans very quickly here. I think this is perhaps maybe a slightly underutilised part of the permitted development. There are a few different scenarios where you can put a caravan on your land. Now, the first thing to say is when we're talking about caravans, and when I'm talking about this on this slide, it actually is not what you might imagine. The definition which I've put up on here, although that's a slightly abbreviated definition, but it's basically any structure designed or adapted for human habitation which is capable of being moved, and that's capable of being moved from one place to another, whether that's towed or transported on a trailer. And actually that could then include static caravans, motorhomes, shepherd's huts, movable lodges, all sorts of things, as well as twin unit caravans. And twin unit caravans can be really quite large. So when I go through these opportunities, you can be thinking in terms of some of those variants of caravans, not just what you might think as a caravan. So the first one is I've just pulled out the ones that apply to agriculture and land. So it looks like it's slightly out of number order. But number one is you can put a caravan in a garden of a dwelling house as long as that use is incidental to the dwelling house. So it's basically extra accommodation. So that can be quite useful if you've got extended family or you've got people that want to come home, or you're not in a position to apply for a house yet or something like that. There's a caravan can go up in the garden without any prior approval or planning consent. It has to meet certain criteria, and that's something that we could run through with you. You can have, providing you've got more than 5 acres, you can go up to your 28 days like we have just covered on the previous slide. You can go with and work with a exempted organisation for a site licence, somebody like the Caravan and Camping Club, and they can issue site licences for up to 5 caravans. So this could also be things like 5 shepherd's huts, 5 lodges, and you can have up to 5 of those, so long as you do it through one of the exemption organisations. If anybody wants a link to that, then let us know and we can send that out. But that's just available on the Natural England website, a list of those organisations. So you join that organisation, they give you a licence, and you can have up to 5 without actually getting planning consent. Number 7 is you can have seasonal workers accommodation. And number 9 is you can live on site in a caravan if you're building a house. So for those that are above, you don't have to give any prior notification at all. Obviously, if you're talking about numbers 4 to 6, you've got to apply to the exempted organisation. Again, something to remember is that this permitted development only allows for the siting of the caravans and no further development. So if you need to put in parking, hard standing for parking, if you wanted to put decking around it, drainage, septic tanks and so on, those are going to start to need planning permission. But again, start with using your permitted development rights, and then we can always tack on a planning application to deal with some of those peripheral things afterwards. Camping is a little bit more limited. There's basically nothing that you can do with camping at the moment other than an exempted organisation. And those exempted organisations, I think, can issue licences for up to 10 tents. Tents can include teepees, bell tents and safari tents and yurts. There is a bit of a definition about it being flexible material, not rigid material, so there's a bit going on there. But the only way of getting tents on your land without planning consent is through one of those certified organisations. However, the government recently did a consultation which back in April, which was to possibly extend permitted development rights to allow camping without that exemption certificate up to 30 tents for up to 60 days a year, plus mobile toilets, showers, etc. There's a strong chance that the government will introduce that at some point over the next few months. So we will watch out for that and see if that happens, but that would be useful and massively expand the opportunities. So just a couple of more minutes then on using planning strategy to create and using these permitted development rights to create capital value. That's things that basically are worth more money because we've got planning for them or permitted development for them. And you can either sell that to create yourself a capital income, which you can use for other parts of the farming business, or buy a yacht and go to the Bahamas. You can increase capital value and then keep that asset, and the increased value of that asset gives you opportunity and increased value perhaps to borrow against. Some of those things that you have now got planning for, if you undertake the development yourself, it can create rental income. And of course, we use planning to improve facilities for alternative business uses and for your farming business. So one quick thing to remind ourselves that when we're thinking about strategies and how to go about things, because honestly, these permitted development rights, if you use them in the right order and the right way, can do so much for your farming business, and you can gain so much value out of them. But you have got to come up with a strategy and line those little ducks up in a row. So you have to make sure that anything that you do under permitted development doesn't affect other permitted development. And the prime example of this is if you use Sally's permitted development, so a 28-day notice for an agricultural building, if you use that on your farm, it means you cannot use Class Q for 10 years after you have exercised your 28-day, your agricultural permitted development rights. It totally scuppers your Class Q and vice versa. So if you use Class Q, you no longer have agricultural permitted development rights for 10 years. That's less of a problem because we can normally get planning permission. But you don't want to be in the position where you bang a 28-day notice application in and then you can't use Class Q. So this is where you need to think about the effects from one to another. So again, use the various classes in your permitted development rights. It can very often be the way of the path of least resistance to getting the long-term outcome. Consider it as a stepping stone. The Class Q, again, you might not actually end up ever building out a Class Q. It might be something different, but you consider it a stepping stone that gets you to an end point. And also use your permitted development where you wouldn't otherwise get planning. I'm just going to give you one little strategy that is arguably a little sneaky one, but I think it's quite a good one. So here on a farm holding, as an example, what we can do is we can use our agricultural permitted development rights first. And as you can see over to the right, we've got lots of extra yard space. So if I were to use my, I've got nothing on here that needs Class Q. There's nothing suitable for Class Q, so I don't need to worry about jeopardizing that. So I'm going to use an agricultural PD 28-day notice to get another shed. That's just a cut and paste, maybe two, something like that. But let's get another agricultural shed the same size. What we're looking at there is a shed that's 450 square meters. So I'm going to use my 28-day notice to get another shed at the back. Then I'm going to use class R on that middle shed, the one with straw in it, that middle shed. I'm going to use a class R on there to change the use of that shed into commercial, so storage or light industrial. That little green shed to the left has got nothing in it, that's already redundant. So what I'm going to do on this farm is I'm now going to partition off those two buildings and a bit of yard space, and I'm going to rent them out. And this is what the money looks like. So just to build a straw shed, because I don't need concrete in there or anything, we could be looking at circa 50k to build another shed. We're going to have to refurbish the existing shed, probably concrete the floor and put some roller shutters on it perhaps. That might be another 40 or 50. So it might cost us 100,000 to build the new shed and get the old one ready for class R. Then I'm going to let out all of that area within the black line, which is the shed and the little green shed. The total floor area to let out is 7,000 square feet. At an average rental in our location, it does vary enormously, but that could earn me around 40,000 a year to let those two buildings out. So in that scenario, we have built ourselves a new shed and we have paid for that new shed and the refurbishment of the other one within 2 years. And then we're expecting a 40 grand a year rental income. And we've all done that entirely through permitted development rights. You just got to do it in the right order. Another couple of quick strategies, really just repeating myself, class Q, use that on a shed to create your fallback position, gets you with planning for a new house where you wouldn't otherwise get it, and it significantly increases the value. We can get, depending on circumstance, multiple buildings if separate planning units. And if we use planning and permitted development together, we should be able to get you planning for replacement agricultural buildings, so you don't have to lose out on building space. So these class Qs are perfect where you've got outlying sheds which aren't in the middle of your farmyard. You can increase the value so that you can sell for capital income, keep, borrow against the increase in value, or to develop it yourselves and rent out. Class R, again, this is extremely useful for the first one on a unit. You know, if you have a series of redundant buildings, then use class R for the first one, get the principle established, and then you can go for planning for subsequent ones afterwards, particularly if you've been able to demonstrate that there are no issues, no highways issues, and very, very useful, as I said, in those designations where it would be tricky to get full planning. And then lastly, I've already said this one, use those exempted organisations to get licences for your 5 caravans where you wouldn't be able to get planning permission, so places like green belts and so on. So that is the end of the presentation. Just a quick tiny little bit about us. We're specialists in agriculture, equestrian, rural business and residential, and we can help you all the way through anything really. So from advice all the way through applications, permitted development applications, notifications, and we cover all of England, and we're proud of our very good success rate. So please do contact us if you think that you've got a project and you would like a little bit of initial advice. We're more than happy to help, and these are our details. So I will finish up and see if Nicola has any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hannah. That was excellent. Yes, we've got plenty of questions. So the first from Robert is, are there any restrictions on derelict buildings? And he added later on that the derelict building has no roof, so a properly derelict building.
Did Robert ask in relation to which permitted development?
No. He may come back to me.
I think if it would be tricky, it probably would be tricky for a class Q, because we've got to be able to show that the building is structurally sound and capable of being converted. If it is derelict and has no roof, I think we're not going to be able to show that it is structurally sound, probably. In terms of other uses, such as class R, technically there is no requirement to show that that building is structurally sound, so you could in theory use a building with no roof on.
Okay.
Anything from an ag point of view, Sally?
I don't think so, particularly. Works to, well, it would depend on whether there's more or less than 5 hectares that you could look to have a new agricultural building on the basis that that one isn't usable. I suppose it's worth mentioning that you can't replace a building under permitted development rights. You can only have a new one. You'd have to do a full planning application technically to replace a building, but you could just put up a new one under permitted development if that's what you're looking to do.
Okay, thank you. From David, we did discuss beforehand the over the border. So David has asked, is Class Q relevant in Wales also?
I'm afraid not, as it is at the moment. No Class Q rights in Wales.
Okay, thank you.
Sadly,
yeah. From Paul, can the caravan be linked up to services such as water and electric under PD?
if the water and electric doesn't require any sort of excavation or groundworks, then yes. It's basically if you have to undertake any type of development to facilitate that. So if you needed to trench it in, then that is excavation. So that would then require planning permission. But basically, if you're running cables to it or pipes to it over ground, then yes, I think under PD you're okay.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sally might say different.
No, I agree with that.
Okay, brilliant. A question for Gillian. Can a Class Q be used to amend a planning permission for a rural workers dwelling, or is it better to apply to amend it to agricultural occupancy with the note that we want to be able to live there after we retire?
So a Class Q doesn't have any occupancy restrictions on. A Class Q is for what's called an open market dwelling, so anybody can live in a Class Q. So there's no occupancy restriction on that. So my preference is always a Class Q because that gives you the maximum amount of options in the future. So anybody that works on the farm, Joe Blogs down the road, anybody can live in a Class Q because there's no occupancy restriction on it. So my advice would always be to, if you don't offer under a Class Q, they can't put any occupancy restrictions on it anyway. So that doesn't come into it. So you wouldn't offer for it to be a rural workers dwelling. It's two separate things. If you're applying under a rural workers dwelling, that's got a whole separate list of criteria and justification that you need to meet. And if you do meet it and can build a house or convert a barn for a rural workers dwelling, they will apply an occupancy condition on that, which means it can only be occupied by a rural worker. I don't know if I've actually answered the question. Class Q has no occupancy on it, so that's better in a way because it's not restricted. If you've already got, so I don't really know what she's got, whether she's already got a rural workers dwelling in a barn or I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's probably related to Class Q, but as to all these things, you know, if you are confused in any way, please call us at the office and we can go through it in more detail. It's quite hard on a webinar. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just add on to that one? I think it was mentioned about wanting to live there after you retire. And obviously all of the points that Hannah said are all absolutely valid in terms of a Class Q is generally a much more broader, flexible option. But if you've already got an agricultural occupancy on a dwelling, if that's the position you're in, then most occupancies conditions are actually worded that you can live there once you retire anyway. If you were last employed in agriculture, then you're still allowed to live there, which may be applicable in this case.
Yeah, so various things on that one, and it might be worth going into it in a bit more detail. Okay, another question. We put in a mobile home, this is from Sandra, we put in a mobile home on wheels in the orchard next to my parents' home, but the wall has deemed the land as not curtilage. we are now trying to prove that it is incidental to the main house. What would you say are examples of incidental use?
The tests for the for it to be allowed as under the Caravan Act in the curtilage of a dwelling house, that it must be incidental, it must be mobile, and it must be in the curtilage, and it has to meet those 3 tests. So unfortunately, if you're in the position that it's not considered in the curtilage, it almost doesn't matter whether you meet the other 2 tests if the council are saying it's not in the curtilage anyway. So you have got to establish that it's curtilage, or you've got to move it so where the council does think that it's curtilage, and then that could, so you would aim for that to be largely bedrooms, kitchenette or something is fine. Obviously you'd have a bathroom in there, but you wouldn't expect it to have like large living quarters, for example. What we often say is that people living in a caravan in the garden might, for example, do their washing in the main house, or they might go for a bath in the main house, something like that, so as that they're using it as extra accommodation, not separate accommodation.
Right, thank you. A question from Matthew: can you use the 28-day (14-day) rule for non-agricultural activities for more than 1 year?
Can you say that again?
It says, can you use the 28-day (14-day) rule for non-agricultural activities for more than 1 year? So I guess the question is there a time scale? Yeah.
It's a calendar year. So it's 28 days in a calendar year.
And then you start the next year with 28 days?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Oh, a nice one. Thank you for an excellent webinar. That's what we like to hear. If a building is in the curtilage of a listed building, but itself is not listed, does Class Q still apply? From Leon.
There's so much grey area about what is considered to be curtilage listed or not. We would have to look at it on an individual case. There is some guidance produced by, is it Historic England, Sally? I can't remember.
Yeah.
I think if you Google curtilage listed Historic England, there's quite a good, quite a chunky, meaty guide on it. And it goes through quite a lot of examples of what is and isn't listed buildings. So without seeing the layout of it, it would be really tricky to hazard a guess. But basically, if the building is of the same, if the building was built after, is it 1949 or 48, I forget, then it can't be curtilage listed. So if the building was built after that date anyway, it can't be curtilage listed, or listed, can be listed, can't be curtilage listed. If it was built before then and it is in close proximity to a curtilage listed building and it is of a similar type of building, in materials or style, it's probably likely that it might be considered curtilage listed. We'd have to look at it.
Okay, great. We'll try for another one. I know we're running out of time, but from Paul, can you confirm an ag building put up under PD nearly 10 years ago and used for agricultural purposes will become available for a Class Q PD at the 10-year anniversary?
Yeah, if it's been up, if it meets that 10-year criteria, it's been in agricultural use, you would need to go through the prior notification process to get the Class Q consent on it.
Yeah.
But assuming there's no other specific restrictions on it, then in principle, yes.
Okay. Is there a limit on number of PD applications you can put in a time frame or in one application? i.e., if you wanted to put up a potato store as well as a non-physically connected grading shed for the stored potatoes? This is to do with the number of PED applications.
Yeah. So in total, you've got your 1,000 metre squared limit every 2 years. That is for development within 90 metres. So if those two separate buildings are more than 90 metres away from each other, then you could actually have more than 1,000 metres. Well, you could have 1,000 metres for each of them. The legislation is worded as a building, but we've done examples in the past of multiple buildings and not ever had a problem with it. So they could go in under the same application. There's no reason why not to put in 2 concurrent applications at the same time. You'd pay an extra £100 in planning fee, but the rest of it would be about the same. So whichever way you did it, there's options to go for them both at the same time.
Brilliant, thanks, Sally.
In theory, more, you could do 3 of 300, couldn't you? No reason why not.
Great, brilliant. Right, we have gone over, so I think probably we'd need to leave it there. But there are questions about, will people be able to see a recording of this webinar? I will send out an email to everybody who has registered for the webinar, and we will be uploading it onto our YouTube channel, where you can find lots of other videos by the Rural Planning Co. So I'll get that out in the next few days. So thank you all for attending, and we hope you found it useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.